The tray felt heavier than it should have, not because of the glasses. Those were light champagne flutes, thin stems, barely anything in them. But Jace held it like it mattered, like dropping one would confirm something people in rooms like this already believed about men who worked the floor. He moved through the ballroom quietly, careful not to brush anyone. No one looked at him, except a girl near the back wall. She sat alone at a small table beside the tall windows, shoulders slightly turned away from the room, one hand resting near her cheek as if she had forgotten it was there. The light from the chandeliers reached everyone else first. It arrived to her late, softer. A group nearby laughed. Not kindly. Jace didn't know her name then. He only saw the way she stayed still when they laughed. And something about that stillness made him stop walking. Just for a moment, long enough to know the night was about to change in a way he wouldn't be able to undo. The ballroom had the kind of light that erased shadows. Crystal chandeliers hung low enough to glow on polished tables and silver cutlery. Every surface reflected something: glass, marble, the smooth black floor. Even the air seemed polished. Jace noticed things like that when he worked rooms like this. Not because he cared about luxury, mostly because it helped him move without bumping into people. A waiter who bumped into guests didn't last long. He adjusted the tray in his left hand and stepped around a group gathered near the center of the room. Their voices blended into the usual rhythm of events like this: soft laughter, half-finished sentences about deals, investments, someone's vacation house somewhere warm. He had worked 3 events that week already. A fundraiser, a wedding rehearsal dinner, and now this, a gala hosted by Graham Armitage. The name had meant something when Jace first heard it 2 days earlier while the catering manager read the job list. A few of the other waiters had reacted to small whistles, raised eyebrows. Big money tonight, someone muttered. Jace hadn't said anything. He just wrote the address down. Now he was here, moving between people whose watches cost more than his car. It didn't bother him the way it used to. There had been a time, a few years ago, when rooms like this made him feel like he'd stepped somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, like security would eventually notice and ask him to leave. That feeling faded after enough shifts. Eventually, it became simple. You wore the uniform. You carried the tray. You kept your head down. People stopped seeing you after a while, which was fine. Being invisible made the work easier. He passed another table and someone lifted 2 fingers slightly without looking up. Jace leaned in, replaced the empty glass in front of them, and stepped away before the conversation paused. A string quartet played somewhere near the far side of the room. The music drifted over the quiet noise of conversation. Slow, careful. The kind of music meant to exist without demanding attention. Jace circled toward the windows. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the Chicago skyline. The lake beyond it was dark tonight, almost flat, the city lights stretching across it in thin lines. Most guests preferred the center of the room where the chandeliers were brightest. The tables near the windows stayed quieter. That was where he saw her. At first it was only the shape of someone sitting alone. A small round table. 1 untouched glass. He slowed slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice. She sat angled toward the window instead of the room. Shoulders turned a little away from the crowd. Her dress was simple compared to the other's: dark blue, no heavy jewelry. Her hair fell across one side of her face, but not the other. The scar caught the light differently, thin and pale, running from just beneath her eye down along the side of her cheek. Not jagged, just present. The kind of mark that made people look once and then quickly look somewhere else. Jace kept walking. That was the job. Keep moving. But something about the way she held herself made him glance again when he passed the next table. Not stiff, not embarrassed either, just quiet, like she had already accepted the distance the room kept from her. He shifted the tray slightly and moved along the edge of the floor. Near her table, a group of 3 guests stood together, 2 men and a woman in a silver dress. They weren't speaking quietly enough. Their laughter came sharp. One of the men leaned slightly toward the others. Still can't believe he brings her to these things. The woman shrugged. She's his daughter. Yeah, but the man lowered his voice only a little. Look at her. Another laugh. Not loud, but enough. Jace felt the tray tilt a fraction before he corrected it. He didn't look at them. That was another rule. Staff didn't react to guests. The girl by the window didn't turn either. She just lifted her glass and took a slow sip of water. Her hand was steady, which somehow made the moment heavier. Jace continued across the floor and reached the service table near the wall where fresh trays waited. He set his empty glasses down and picked up another. The catering manager stood nearby, checking something on a clipboard. "You're good on champagne rotation," she said without looking up. "Make sure the back tables stay filled." "Got it," Jace replied. His voice came out low, almost automatic. He lifted the new tray. Turned. The room looked the same as before. People talking, music drifting, servers moving quietly between them. Except now, he knew exactly where the girl was sitting. His eyes found the table near the window again without trying. She had placed her glass down. Her hands rested together in her lap. Across the room, someone clinked a spoon against a glass, calling for attention, and conversations shifted slightly, but she remained outside the center of it. Like a detail, people stepped around. Jace moved through another row of tables offering drinks. "Champagne. Thank you. Yes, please. Routine." He reached the group who had laughed earlier. One of the men took a glass without acknowledging him. The woman glanced toward the window briefly. "Poor thing," she murmured. The other man shrugged. "Accidents happen." Jace didn't wait for more. He turned away. The tray had grown lighter now. Only 4 glasses left. He moved again toward the window side of the room. Closer this time. The girl hadn't changed position much. The skyline reflected faintly in the glass behind her, surrounding her in soft lights. For a moment he thought she might stand up and leave. Instead, she stayed seated, watching the lake. Or maybe just the reflection of the room behind her. Jace slowed as he passed her table, not stopping, just slowing, close enough to see the scar more clearly. It wasn't the kind people stared at because it looked frightening. It was the kind that made people uncomfortable because it reminded them something had happened, something real, something they couldn't smooth over with polite conversation. Her eyes lifted suddenly. They met his, only for a second. Jace felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Not pity, something else. Recognition, maybe. The kind that happened when 2 people understood a silence without explaining it. He almost offered the tray, but she already had a drink. And waiters didn't linger. So he moved past, still carrying the last 4 glasses, still part of the quiet machinery of the evening. But now the room felt slightly different, like something small had shifted. Not in the crowd. Inside him, and he wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about it. Jace returned the tray to the service table. Someone beside him stacked clean glasses. Another waiter carried out a fresh round of appetizers, small plates arranged with careful precision, each piece placed exactly where it belonged. The work moved like that in rooms like this. Quiet coordination. No wasted motion. He wiped his hands on the folded cloth at his waist and picked up another tray. This one held sparkling water instead of champagne. The catering manager leaned toward him slightly. "Window section again," she said. Jace nodded. "Sure." He lifted the tray and stepped back into the room. The music had changed, still soft but slower now. Conversations had deepened into smaller circles. People leaned closer to each other. That usually happened about 40 minutes into an event. Enough drinks, enough introductions. The real conversation started. Jace moved along the edge of the floor again, offering water where glasses had emptied. A man waved him over, barely glancing up while explaining something about venture capital to the people around him. Jace replaced 2 glasses and stepped away. The tray stayed balanced in his hand without effort. His eyes drifted again toward the windows. She was still there. Same table, same quiet posture. The only change was that someone had placed a folded program beside her plate, likely a staff member earlier. She hadn't touched it. 2 guests passed near her table and lowered their voices instinctively as they walked by. Not out of respect, more like caution. As if proximity required adjustment. Jace slowed again while moving past the nearby tables. This time he noticed something else. She wasn't watching the lake anymore. She was watching the room. Not openly. Just small glances, observing the same way he did while working, the way people did when they weren't fully part of the space around them. Another laugh rose from somewhere behind him. Jace didn't turn, but the sound carried enough for him to recognize the same voices from earlier. The group had moved closer to the windows now. The woman in the silver dress leaned toward the others again. "She used to be pretty," she said quietly. The words weren't meant to travel. But they did. Jace kept walking. 3 steps. 4. Then he stopped beside a different table, offering water to a couple who hadn't asked for it. The man took a glass with a distracted nod. "Thank you." Jace moved again. The tray had grown lighter. The distance between him and the window table shortened slowly. He felt the thought forming before he fully recognized it. It arrived the way certain decisions always had in his life. Not dramatic, just steady. A small pressure building in the background. He remembered another room suddenly. Not this one. The tent overseas years earlier. Dust hanging in the air. The smell of metal and heat. Someone laughing at something cruel in the same careless way. He had been younger then. Angrier. And Elliot. Jace stopped the memory before it finished. He shifted the tray in his hand. Focus. That was the rule now. Focus on what was in front of you. He approached the window tables. The group of 3 guests had drifted a few feet away, still talking. The girl remained seated alone. Closer now, Jace could see the scar more clearly. It wasn't recent. The skin had settled long ago. But the mark still carried a story. People always sensed that. Sometimes they asked. Sometimes they avoided asking. Sometimes they whispered. Her hands rested around the base of her glass again. She noticed him approaching this time. Her eyes lifted. Calm, a little curious. Jace stopped beside the table. "Sparkling water?" he asked. His voice stayed even. She glanced at the tray, then shook her head gently. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was softer than he expected, not fragile. "Just quiet." Jace nodded. "Of course." Normally that would be the end of it. Waiter offers drink. Guest declines. Waiter moves on. He should have turned immediately. Instead, he hesitated half a second too long. Long enough for the pause to become noticeable. Her eyes studied him slightly now. Not in the dismissive way many guests looked at staff. Just noticing. "You don't have to stand here," she said. The words weren't unkind. More like she was helping him follow the rules he already knew. Jace almost smiled. Almost. "Right," he said, but he didn't move yet. The group nearby laughed again. Quieter this time, but still there. The girl's shoulders shifted a fraction. Not shrinking, just adjusting. Something in Jace tightened again. It wasn't anger exactly, more like memory pressing forward. He set the tray down gently on the empty chair beside the table. That alone was enough to break the invisible line between staff and guest. She noticed. Her brow lifted slightly. "You might get in trouble for that," she said. "Probably," Jace replied. Another small pause settled between them. The music from the quartet drifted through the room again. Slow violin notes. People nearby continued talking. No one had noticed yet. Jace rested his hand lightly on the back of the chair across from her. Not sitting, just standing there. He chose his next words carefully. Not because they were complicated, because once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. "I was wondering something," he said. Her eyes narrowed just slightly in curiosity. "What?" Jace glanced toward the center of the room where couples had begun moving slowly to the music. Then back to her. "I was wondering," he said quietly, "if you'd like to dance." The silence that followed felt different from the others that night. He saw the surprise first, then something else. Not disbelief, more like she was checking whether she had heard correctly. Behind them, someone laughed again. The same voices. One of the men noticed Jace standing there and frowned slightly. Waiters didn't chat with guests. Certainly not like this. The girl looked toward the dance floor, then back at Jace. "You work here," she said. "Tonight," he answered. "That's not what I meant." "I know." Another pause. She studied him more carefully now, trying to understand the intention behind the question. Jace didn't rush her. He just waited, the way he had learned to wait in other places, other years. Let the moment decide, Finally, she looked toward the group who had been whispering earlier, then toward the rest of the ballroom, then back to him. One corner of her mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile. "You realize," she said quietly, "everyone will stare." Jace considered that, then gave a small shrug. "They already are." For the first time that evening, she laughed. Soft, unexpected. And something in the room shifted again. Not loudly. Just enough that Jace felt it. She looked down at her hands for a moment, thinking. When she lifted her head again, her eyes were different, still cautious, but warmer. "All right," she said. Then she placed her hand lightly in his. Her hand felt cooler than he expected. Not weak, not hesitant, just cool, like she had been sitting near the glass long enough for the night air to reach her skin. Jace helped her stand. The chair moved quietly against the floor. For a moment, nothing else in the room changed. Conversations continued. The violin carried its slow line through the air. Then the first person noticed. A man near the bar paused mid-sentence. Another guest followed his gaze. It happened the way small ripples spread across water. One person looked, then another. Then the circle widened, because waiters didn't take guests to the dance floor. And they certainly didn't take her. Jace was aware of the eyes, but he didn't rush. Rushing would make the moment look like a mistake. He simply walked. 2 slow steps ahead of her, guiding gently the way the servers had been trained to escort guests to tables earlier in the evening. Except this time, the direction was different, toward the center of the ballroom. The quartet continued playing, unaware, or perhaps deliberately pretending not to notice the shift in attention. Isla, though Jace still didn't know her name, walked beside him with careful posture. Her shoulders stayed straight, her chin slightly lifted, but he felt the tension in her hand. Not fear, more like the weight of being visible. They reached the edge of the dance floor. Couples moved slowly in quiet circles beneath the chandeliers. Expensive dresses brushed against dark suits. Polished shoes glided across the smooth floor. Jace stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. He realized something then. "I should probably introduce myself," he said quietly. She looked at him with a small tilt of her head. "That would help." "Jace. Isla." He repeated it once in his mind. Isla. The name fit her somehow, something calm about it. He offered his hand again, this time not as someone guiding a guest, as someone asking. She placed her hand in his. Around them, the room had grown subtly quieter. People tried to pretend they weren't watching, but they were. Jace placed his other hand lightly at her side. Careful, respectful, enough to guide the movement. "Full warning," he said quietly. "I'm out of practice." Isla's mouth curved slightly. "I think we'll survive." The music carried them into the first slow step. Jace had learned to dance years ago, long before the army, back when things had been simpler. A wedding of a friend's sister, someone pulling him onto a small wooden floor, under string lights. He hadn't thought about it in a long time, but the rhythm came back. Step, turn, slow shift of weight. Isla followed easily. Her movements were careful at first, like she was testing the space around her. The scar on her cheek caught the chandelier light each time she turned. But something else happened too. People stopped whispering. Not all of them, but enough. Because the image in front of them didn't match the quiet assumptions they had been carrying earlier in the night. The girl who had been sitting alone near the window was now in the center of the room. And she wasn't shrinking. Jace kept his attention on her, not the crowd. "Are you okay?" he asked softly after a moment. She glanced past his shoulder toward the tables. "They're confused." That wasn't the question. Her eyes returned to his. For a second, the practiced composure slipped. "I'm adjusting," she said. He nodded. That made sense. They turned again with the music. Across the floor, several guests watched openly now. One woman leaned toward another, whispering something while pointing subtly in their direction. Near the entrance, a tall man in a dark suit had stopped speaking to the person beside him. His gaze was fixed on the dance floor. Jace noticed him only briefly. Then the music shifted into a longer note. Isla spoke again. "Why did you do this?" Her voice stayed quiet enough that only he could hear. Jace considered the question. There were several answers. None of them sounded right out loud, so he told the closest truth. "You looked like you shouldn't have been sitting alone." She studied him carefully. "That happens a lot." "I figured." They moved again, slower this time. Her posture changed slightly with the rhythm. Less guarded now. More natural. A small line of tension left her shoulders. "You're not like the other staff," she said. Jace let out a soft breath. Management might disagree. That made her smile again. Not wide, but real. For a moment the room felt almost normal. Two people dancing. Music. Soft light. Then a voice broke through from the edge of the floor. "Excuse me." It wasn't loud, but it carried authority. Jace and Isla both turned slightly. The tall man in the dark suit had stepped closer. Up close, Jace could see the resemblance immediately. The same eyes, the same sharp line of the jaw. Older now, but unmistakable. The man looked first at Isla, then at Jace. His expression held more confusion than anger. "Isla," he said quietly. Her hand tightened slightly in Jace's. "Yes, Dad." The man's gaze returned to Jace. "You work here?" "Yes, sir." "And yet you're dancing with my daughter." The words weren't hostile, but they carried weight. Jace released a slow breath. "That's correct." Around them, the entire dance floor had begun to slow, couples drifting farther apart, watching. The man studied him for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, exactly. More like a distant memory brushing past. His eyes moved briefly to Jace's jacket pocket. A corner of white cloth showed there. Just slightly. Jace hadn't noticed earlier. It must have slipped loose while they were dancing. The man's brow furrowed, his voice lowered. "Where did you get that?" Jace followed his gaze downward. "The handkerchief. Old cotton, folded unevenly from years of carrying it, and stitched in one corner with a name Jace had never removed. Elliot." Jace followed the man's gaze. For a moment he didn't understand the question. Then he saw it. The corner of the handkerchief had slipped from his pocket while they were moving, just a small edge of white cloth visible against the dark uniform jacket. He had carried it for years, long enough that sometimes he forgot it was there. Until someone noticed. Jace reached down slowly and pulled it free. The fabric was worn soft now, folded too many times. One corner, slightly frayed, and stitched there, in careful thread that had faded with time, was the name Elliot. The room had grown quieter again, though no one had been asked to stop speaking. That kind of silence happened naturally when something unusual settled into a space meant for comfort. The tall man, Graham Armitage, looked at the handkerchief like it had stepped out of another decade and walked into the ballroom. His voice changed. "Where did you get that?" The question wasn't sharp anymore. It carried something heavier. Jace felt Isla's hand still resting lightly in his. Neither of them had stepped away yet. The music from the quartet continued, though, softer now, like the musicians sensed the shift without understanding it. Jace looked at the cloth in his hand. There were easier answers he could have given. Found it. Bought it somewhere. A coincidence. But the name was too clear. And Graham Armitage's eyes were already searching his face for something more. Jace folded the handkerchief once, then again, carefully. The habit had become automatic over the years. "I served with him," Jace said. The words were simple, but they didn't move through the room quietly. Graham Armitage didn't speak. Isla turned her head slightly toward Jace, confusion crossing her expression for the first time since they stepped onto the floor. "You knew my uncle?" she asked softly. Jace nodded once. "Yes?" The room around them had shifted completely now. Guests who had been pretending not to watch no longer bothered with the act. Conversations had thinned to murmurs. A few people stepped closer without realizing they were doing it. Graham Armitage took another step toward them. Not aggressive, just closer. "How?" he asked. The single word carried years behind it. Jace understood that immediately. He had seen that kind of question before. usually from families who had never received the full story. He glanced briefly at Isla. She was still holding his hand, still standing in the middle of the dance floor where he had led her only minutes earlier. The room had expected a moment of embarrassment, a staff member overstepping, maybe a quiet apology and a quick return to serving drinks. Instead, something else had opened. Something older than the gala, older than the room. Jace released Isla's hand gently, not pulling away quickly, just enough to shift the moment. She didn't step back. Neither did Graham. Afghanistan, Jace said. The word landed with quiet weight. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Military stories rarely appeared at events like this. Too real, too close to things people preferred to keep abstract. Graham Armitage's eyes didn't move from Jace's face. My brother was stationed there, he said. It wasn't a question. I know. Another pause. Jace felt the memory rising behind his ribs again, not the way it did in nightmares. This was different, clearer, more controlled, but still heavy. The quartet had stopped playing now. The last note hung in the air for a moment before fading. No one clapped. The silence was deeper than that. Isla spoke again. You said you served with him. Yes. What unit? Jace hesitated. Not because he didn't want to answer, because speaking the details out loud felt like opening a door he had kept closed for a long time. Recon support, he said finally. Forward observation team. Graham's jaw tightened slightly. My brother wrote about that, he said. Sometimes. Jace nodded. Elliot had written letters. He remembered that, sitting on an ammo crate near the tent entrance once, pen moving slowly across a small notebook, while the rest of them checked gear. Elliot had always written carefully, like he wanted each word to reach home intact. Isla looked between the two men. Wait, she said quietly. You're saying you knew him there, when he died? Jace's grip on the folded handkerchief tightened slightly. Yes. The room felt colder somehow. Graham Armitage didn't look shocked. Not exactly. More like someone who had spent years living beside an unfinished sentence. And you've been carrying that? He asked, nodding toward the cloth. Jace glanced down at it again. Yes. For how long? Since the day he gave it to me. A few guests shifted their weight uneasily. They had expected champagne and speeches about charity. Not this. Graham's voice dropped even lower. My brother was killed during an operation, he said. That's what the report said. Jace didn't interrupt. The report. He knew the one. 2 pages. Technical language. Carefully measured phrases. Enough to explain the outcome. Not enough to explain the moment. That's right, Jace said quietly. Graham watched him for a long time. Then he asked the question Jace had known would come. Were you there? Jace nodded once. Yes. Another silence. Not uncomfortable. Just dense. Like the room itself had begun to listen. Isla's voice softened. You don't have to talk about it, she said. The words surprised him slightly. Most people asked for details immediately, but she said it like she understood what the story might weigh. Jace looked at her, then at Graham. The older man's expression had changed again. The earlier confusion was gone. Now there was something else. Pope. Careful. Fragile. Jace had seen that look too. Families waiting to hear something that might shift the memory of a loss they had carried for years. He hadn't meant for the evening to reach this place. He had only wanted one thing. To make sure the girl by the window didn't spend the night alone under whispered laughter. But the handkerchief had slipped from his pocket. And once that happened, the truth was already halfway into the room. Jace took a slow breath. His voice stayed calm when he spoke. There's something the report didn't say. That sentence moved through the ballroom like a quiet current. No one interrupted. No one moved. Graham Armitage's eyes held steady on Jace's. What? He asked. Jace unfolded the handkerchief slowly. The name in the corner caught the chandelier light again. Elliot. His fingers brushed the stitched letters, and for a moment the ballroom disappeared. Not completely. Just enough that another place rose in its shadow. Dust. Heat. The distant crack of gunfire. Elliot's voice shouting something over the noise. Jace lifted his head again, looking directly at Graham. The report says Elliot died during the retreat. Graham nodded slowly. That's what we were told. Jace swallowed once. Then he said the part he had carried alone for years. He didn't die retreating. The words landed in the center of the room, and nothing in the ballroom felt the same anymore. No one moved. The sentence stayed in the air like something fragile that might break if anyone spoke too quickly. He didn't die retreating. Jace hadn't planned to say it like that. The words simply arrived in the order memory, pushed him forward. Across from him, Graham Armitage's face remained still, but the stillness carried effort, the kind people use when they're trying to keep their thoughts from running ahead of what they're hearing. Isla looked from one man to the other. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her voice stayed quiet, not demanding, just asking for the shape of something she had never been given. Jace felt the old weight return behind his ribs. For years, the story had lived only inside his head, surfacing in pieces at odd moments while standing in grocery lines, sitting in traffic, waking in the middle of the night when sleep broke apart. He had learned to push it back down again. Tonight, it had followed him into a ballroom. He folded the handkerchief once more. His fingers knew exactly how the cloth fit back into its square shape. "I don't think this is the place," he said. Not because he wanted to hide anything. Because rooms like this weren't built for memories like that. Graham Armitage didn't look away. 8 years, he said quietly. The number hung there. 8 years since the phone call. 8 years since the official report arrived with its careful language and quiet condolences. 8 years of a story that ended before the important part. The older man's voice softened. "If you know something, you can say it." Isla stepped slightly closer to her father now, though her attention remained on Jace. "You don't have to rush," she added. The kindness in her voice surprised him again. Most people lean toward stories like this with a kind of hunger. She didn't. She spoke like someone offering space. Jace glanced around the ballroom. Guests stood in quiet clusters now. The earlier laughter had faded completely. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A few seemed genuinely moved. None of them belonged in the memory that was about to surface. Jace took a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and wine. Nothing like dust. Nothing like smoke. Still, the memory pushed forward. "We were moving through a village," he began. His voice stayed steady. Late afternoon. Heat was starting to drop. The words came slowly at first, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground after a long absence. "Recon team. 6 of us." He could see it again. The narrow road, the sun lowering behind broken rooftops. We were supposed to be in and out. A small, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That's usually the plan." Graham Armitage listened without interrupting. Isla's eyes stayed fixed on Jace's face, as if she could see the place he was remembering. "There was an explosion," Jace said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't describe the sound. Some things didn't need decoration. Our vehicle took the hit. The ballroom felt very far away now. Jace saw the dust rising. Felt the metal frame twist around him again. I couldn't move my leg. He paused. The memory of that moment was always sharp. Not panic. Not yet. Just the realization that something had gone wrong in a way that wasn't easy to fix. "The others got clear," he continued. "Elliot stayed." Graham's eyes lowered slightly. Jace kept speaking. "He came back for me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that followed. Pulled the door open. Dragged me out. He glanced briefly at the handkerchief in his hands. "He gave me this then." Isla frowned slightly. During that, Jace nodded, wrapped it around my leg to slow the bleeding. He lifted the cloth slightly as he spoke, the faded stitching catching the light again. "It wasn't meant to be something I kept." Another small pause. that things didn't go the way we thought. No one in the ballroom shifted now. The room had become completely still. Jace could feel the moment approaching, the one he had carried for 8 years without saying aloud. Graham Armitage spoke again, his voice rougher. What happened next? Jace met his eyes, and for the first time that night, he let the rest of the memories step forward. There was a second explosion. The words landed quietly. But they changed the air in the room. Not far, Jace continued. Close enough that the ground shook. He swallowed once. The vehicle started burning. Isla inhaled softly. And you? I was outside by then. He paused again, because the next part had never been written in the report. Not clearly, not fully. Jace looked at Graham. Your brother saved my life, he had said earlier. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Elliot could have left with the others, Jace said slowly. He had time. Graham's face tightened. But he didn't. Jace's voice dropped slightly. Someone else was still inside. The words spread through the room like a quiet shock. Isla's brow furrowed. There was another soldier? Jace shook his head. No. He felt the memory rise fully now. The part that had never belonged to official reports or military summaries. The driver was a local contractor, Jace said. A civilian. Graham looked at him sharply. The report never mentioned that. I know. The reason wasn't complicated. Civilian details sometimes disappeared when paperwork moved through official channels. Easier that way. Cleaner. But Elliot hadn't treated it that way. Chase's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. He went back for him. Silence pressed in again, the kind that filled the entire space between one breath and the next. Isla whispered the question before her father could. And then? Jace closed his eyes for a brief moment. Just long enough to see it clearly again. Elliot running back toward the burning vehicle, smoke already pouring from the broken door. The rest of the team shouting. The sound of metal cracking under heat. Jace opened his eyes again. He got the man out, he said. His voice remained calm, but something behind it had shifted, pushed him clear. Another pause. And then the fire reached the fuel line. No one in the ballroom moved. No one needed to ask what that meant. Jace looked down at the handkerchief one more time, then back at Graham Armitage. That's how your brother died. For a long moment, no one spoke. Not Graham, not Isla, not anyone in the ballroom. The story had arrived somewhere deeper than curiosity. Even the guests who had edged closer now seemed unsure where to put their attention. Some stared at the floor. Others watched Jace, like he might say something that would reshape what they had just heard. Graham Armitage looked older than he had a few minutes earlier. Not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the way his shoulders held the air. You're certain? He asked. The question wasn't doubt, it was something else. Someone touching the edges of a memory that had been sealed too tightly. Jace nodded once. Yes. Graham's eyes dropped briefly to the handkerchief in Jace's hand. My brother, he said slowly. He always did things like that. There was a faint breath of something that might have been a laugh. Not amused. Just recognition. He used to stop the car if he saw someone stranded on the highway. Didn't matter if we were late. Easta glanced at him. You never told me that. Graham shrugged slightly. There were a lot of things I didn't think mattered to tell. The words lingered there between them. Jace remained quiet. The story had reached its end, but the feeling behind it still moved through the room like something settling into place. A few people began shifting again. Someone coughed softly. Glassware clinked somewhere near the bar. The world outside the memory was returning. Isla stepped closer to Jace now. Her eyes searched his face again, not with curiosity this time, with understanding. You carried that alone? She asked. Jace hesitated, then gave a small shrug. I didn't know how to tell it. Her gaze moved to the cloth in his hand. That's why you kept it. It wasn't a question. Jace nodded. Your uncle gave it to me while we were still joking around about something stupid. 10 minutes later, everything changed. He folded the handkerchief again and slid it back into his pocket. The motion felt different now. For years, the cloth had been something he held on to because he wasn't sure what else to do with it. Tonight, it felt like it had finally found the place it belonged. Graham Armitage exhaled slowly. I spent a long time wondering about that day, he said. Official reports, they don't leave room for people. Jace understood exactly what he meant. Those reports were written to explain events, not decisions, not courage. Graham looked at him again. Why didn't you contact us? Jace considered the question honestly. Your family lost someone, he said. I didn't feel like the man who lived should be the one knocking on your door. Graham studied him for a moment. Then something softened in his expression. That's not how Elliot would have seen it. Jace believed that too. But believing something and living with it were different things. Isla looked out across the ballroom briefly. The crowd had thinned around them. Guests had quietly drifted back to their tables, unsure how to behave after witnessing something so personal. Her voice came calm. They were laughing at me earlier. Jace followed her gaze toward the windows where she had been sitting alone. I heard. She nodded slightly. I'm used to it. The words were said without bitterness. Just fact. My father thinks bringing me to events like this helps people get used to seeing the scar, she continued. Graham shifted uncomfortably. Isla. It's okay, she said gently. You're trying. She looked back at Jace. But when you asked me to dance, her voice paused there, like she was searching for the right shape at the moment. No one has done that before, she finished. Jace felt something tighten quietly in his chest. It didn't seem like a big thing, he said. For you, maybe. Isla's smile was small but steady. For me, it was. Across the room, the quartet began tuning their instruments again. The soft notes of violin strings being adjusted drifted through the air. Normal sounds. The kind that return after a moment that interrupts the rhythm of a place. Graham cleared his throat. I owe you something, he said to Jace. Jace shook his head immediately. No. You gave my family the truth about my brother. That wasn't a favor. Graham considered that, then nodded slowly. Still. He extended his hand. Jace hesitated only a moment before taking it. The handshake was firm, not formal. Just two men acknowledging something that had passed between them. When they released, Graham glanced toward Isla. You look different, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Different how? Standing there, he replied, like you belong in the room. Isla glanced down briefly, then back up. Maybe I always did. Graham smiled faintly. Maybe. The music began again then, slow and careful. Couples gradually returned to the dance floor, though the mood had shifted into something quieter. Jace stepped back slightly. I should get back to work. The words sounded ordinary again, almost strange after everything that had just happened. Isla tilted her head. You're still thinking like a waiter. Tonight, I am one. She looked like she might argue that point. Instead, she said something else. Would you dance again? The question surprised him. Jace glanced briefly at the room, then back at her. Your father might have opinions about that. Graham raised one eyebrow. I'm listening. Jace waited. The older man held the silence for a moment longer, then shrugged. My daughter looks happier than she did an hour ago. He stepped aside slightly. I'm not going to interrupt that. Isla held out her hand again. This time, Jace didn't hesitate. When they stepped back onto the dance floor, fewer people stared. Not because the moment mattered less, because something about it had already been understood. The music moved gently around them, and for the first time that night, the ballroom felt less like a place full of strangers, and more like somewhere two people could simply stand without carrying quite as much weight as before. The music had started again, but softer this time. Not because the musicians were playing differently. The room itself had changed. Conversations returned in careful pieces, like people were testing whether normal sounds still belonged there. Jace and Isla moved slowly with the rhythm. The second dance felt different from the first. Earlier there had been tension in the air, eyes watching, people waiting for the moment to become awkward. Now the room had already seen the awkward part. What remained felt quieter. Isla didn't look toward the tables anymore. She focused on the steps, then on Jace, then briefly at the floor when she lost the rhythm and found it again. "You weren't planning to say any of that tonight," she said after a moment. Jace shook his head. "No, I figured." They turned slowly beneath the chandelier. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. "What part?" "Telling the story after all this time." Jace considered the question while guiding the next step. "It feels." He paused, searching for the right word. "Lighter." Ida studied his face carefully. "Not easier?" "No." That answer came without hesitation. She nodded, as if she understood the difference. Across the room, Graham Armitage stood near the edge of the dance floor, speaking quietly with one of the event organizers. But every so often, his attention drifted back toward them, not watching with suspicion anymore. "Just observing," Jace noticed. "You're close with him?" he asked. "My father?" "Yes." Isla gave a small half-smile. "Define close." Jace waited. She thought for a moment. "He tries," she said finally. "That counts." The music shifted slightly, violin and piano moving together in a slower line. Jace adjusted his step so she didn't stumble. "You've been to a lot of these events," he said. "Too many. And they always go like tonight?" Isla raised one eyebrow. "Most nights, a waiter doesn't ask me to dance in front of the entire guest list." "Fair point." She laughed softly. But the sound faded quickly. "People stare," she said after a moment. Jace knew what she meant. "The scar." "Yes." She touched the edge of her cheek lightly without thinking. "Car accident," she continued. "I was 17. The words were delivered simply, not dramatic. The kind of explanation she had probably given dozens of times. Jace nodded. "That must have been rough." "Not at first." She met his eyes again. "At first, people were just relieved I survived." He waited. "Later," she said, "they started looking at me differently." Another slow turn carried them across the floor. Jace didn't respond immediately. He had learned that sometimes silence was better than offering sympathy that sounded rehearsed. Isla seemed to appreciate that. "You didn't look away," she said quietly. "When?" "Earlier." "At the table." Jace shrugged slightly. "I've seen worse scars." Her eyes flickered with curiosity. "From the army. From life." That answer made her smile again. Small, but steady. For a few moments they danced without speaking. The rhythm settled. Their steps matched more easily now. Near the edge of the room, a server carried another tray of drinks past a group of guests who had begun talking again, though their voices remained subdued. Jace recognized a few of the other staff watching him from a distance. Their expressions were somewhere between confusion and amusement. He would probably hear about this later. He didn't mind. Isla spoke again. "Did my uncle talk about us?" "Your family?" She nodded. "Sometimes." "What did he say?" Jace thought back. "Elliot's sitting outside the tent entrance with a notebook, writing slowly. He said his niece was stubborn." Isla's eyes widened. "That sounds accurate." "He said you used to argue with your teachers." "Also accurate." Jace allowed a faint smile. "He was proud of you." The words landed gently. Isla didn't answer right away. She looked down for a moment as they continued moving. "I wish I remembered him better," she said quietly. "You remember enough." "How do you know?" "Because you asked about him." She looked up again, and for the first time that night, the scar on her cheek seemed to matter less than the expression behind it. Across the ballroom, Graham Armitage had finished speaking with the organizer. Now he stood alone for a moment, watching the two of them. Jace noticed the way the older man's posture had changed. Less guarded. Like something unresolved had shifted into place. "Your father seems like a serious man," Jace said. "He is. Was he always like that?" "No." Her answer came quickly. "What changed?" She didn't need to think long. "My uncle died." The sentence sat between them quietly. Jace nodded. Grief did that to people. Sometimes it sharpened them. Sometimes it closed doors inside them. He tried to keep everything together after that, Isla continued. Business, family, everything. And you? I tried not to make things harder. Jace understood the weight hidden inside that sentence. The music carried them through another slow turn. Isla glanced toward the windows where she had been sitting earlier. I almost didn't come tonight, she said. Why not? Because I knew how the room would feel. And now? She thought about that for a moment. Now I'm glad I did. Jace followed her gaze toward the city lights beyond the glass. Chicago stretched into the dark distance, quiet and steady. A place where millions of lives moved without noticing each other. Funny how one evening could change the shape of a few of them. The music slowed again. Isla spoke softly. You know something strange? What? If you hadn't asked me to dance, none of this would have happened. Jace nodded. That's usually how small decisions work. She studied him carefully. You don't think it was small? No. Why? Jace considered the question. Then he answered honestly. Because I almost didn't do it. Her brow lifted slightly. What stopped you? Common sense. She laughed again. And what changed your mind? Jace looked briefly toward the window table where she had been sitting alone earlier. The way you stayed there when people were laughing. Isla's expression softened. You heard that. Yeah. She didn't look embarrassed, just thoughtful. I stayed because leaving would have felt worse. Jace nodded slowly. He understood that kind of decision, the kind where dignity meant holding your ground even when the room hoped you would disappear. The music reached its final notes. This time when it ended, a few people clapped politely, not for the band, for the moment itself. Isla stepped back slightly. Her hand remained in his for a second longer than necessary. Thank you, she said. Jace shook his head gently. You already said that. I know. Her smile returned. I meant for the second dance. Jace was about to answer when Graham Armitage approached them again. His expression was calmer now, but his eyes carried something thoughtful. Jace, he said. Yes, sir. There's one more thing I want to ask you. Jace waited. Graham glanced briefly toward the pocket where the handkerchief rested. After Elliot pulled you out of that vehicle and went back inside, he paused, like he was stepping carefully into the last part of a story he had lived beside for years. Did he say anything? The question landed quietly, but it carried more weight than everything before it. Jace felt the memory shift again. Because there had been words. Just a few. Spoken through smoke and noise, words Jace had never repeated out loud. Until now. He looked at Graham, then at Isla, and he realized something. This part of the story didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to them. Jace didn't answer right away. The question settled into him first. Did he say anything? For years that moment had lived inside his memory without an audience. Not because the words were dramatic, not because they were heroic, because they were ordinary. And sometimes ordinary words carried more weight than the kind people expected to hear in stories about war. The ballroom remained quiet again, not the stunned silence from earlier. This one was softer. People had drifted back to their tables, but their attention still circled the three figures standing near the center of the room. Jace rubbed his thumb briefly against the edge of the handkerchief inside his pocket. Then he looked at Graham. Yes, he said. Graham didn't move. Isla leaned slightly closer. What did he say? She asked. Jace exhaled slowly. For a second the ballroom disappeared again. Not fully, just enough for the other place to return. The smell of smoke, the sharp metallic heat in the air, the sound of someone shouting his name while pulling him across broken ground. Jace saw Elliot again, face smudged with dust, eyes focused, calm in a way that never made sense until later. He told me to stop apologizing, Jace said. The sentence sounded almost strange in the quiet ballroom. Isla blinked. Apologizing, Jace nodded. I kept telling him it was my fault the vehicle got hit. The memory rose clearly now. Jace lying half outside the wreckage, pain running through his leg. Elliot crouched beside him, tying the handkerchief tight to slow the bleeding. "He looked at me like I was being an idiot," Jace said. Graham's mouth tightened slightly. "That sounds like him." Jace continued. He said, "Miller, none of us gets to choose where the blast lands." A few guests nearby exchanged quiet glances. Jace's voice remained steady. "Then he told me something else." He paused briefly, because that part had never belonged to the official story. It had belonged to the seconds before Elliot stood up and ran back toward the vehicle. Jace looked at Isla, then at Graham. He said if anything happened, I should make sure you knew he didn't regret being there. The words landed softly, but they settled deep. Isla's eyes widened slightly. Graham didn't look away. Jace continued. He said people spend too much time wishing they were somewhere safer. Another breath, and that he'd rather be exactly where he was. For a moment, the only sound in the ballroom was the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Graham's jaw shifted as he absorbed the words. "My brother," he said quietly, "always had a strange relationship with danger." Jace gave a small nod. He wasn't chasing danger. No. No. Jace looked toward the floor briefly. He just never ran from responsibility. The sentence settled into the room with quiet certainty. Isla blinked quickly once, not crying, but close. "I wish I remembered his voice," she said softly. Jace thought about that. Then he said something he hadn't planned. "You might." She looked at him, confused. "How?" "Sometimes people carry the same things without realizing it." Isla tilted her head slightly. "What things?" Jace gestured gently around the ballroom. "The way you stayed in that chair earlier." Her brow furrowed. "You think that's the same?" "Maybe." He shrugged. "Your uncle would have stayed too." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. "That's comforting." Across the room, someone lifted a glass again, and conversation slowly began returning to normal levels. But the energy had changed. Guests spoke more quietly now. The earlier sharp laughter had disappeared. Even the people who had whispered about Isla earlier seemed less certain of themselves. Graham noticed that too. His eyes moved across the room before returning to Jace. "You gave us something tonight," he said. Jace shook his head gently. "No. Yes." The older man's voice stayed calm but firm. "For 8 years we had a report and a folded flag." He gestured slightly toward Jace's pocket. "Now we have the rest of the story." Jace didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence did the work better. Isla looked toward the windows again. The skyline stretched out in steady lights across the lake. "You know," she said quietly, "this is the first gala where I don't feel like leaving early." Jace allowed a faint smile. "That's progress." She studied him again. "What happens to the handkerchief now?" Jace thought about the question. For years, he had assumed the answer was simple. He would keep it. Always. But standing here, in front of Elliot's family, that certainty felt different. He pulled the cloth from his pocket again. The stitching had faded, but the name remained clear. Elliot. Jace held it out toward Graham. "This belongs with you." The older man looked at the cloth but didn't take it immediately. "You carried it for 8 years. That doesn't make it mine." Graham studied Jace for a long moment. Then he glanced toward Isla. She gave a small nod. Only then did Graham reach forward and take the handkerchief. His fingers closed around it carefully, like something fragile had just been returned. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jace nodded once. The moment didn't need more words. Across the room the music began again, not as soft this time. The evening was moving forward again. Waiters resumed their routes between tables. The quiet machinery of the gala returned to life. Jace glanced toward the service station where the catering manager stood watching him with raised eyebrows. He exhaled slightly. "I should probably get back to carrying trays before I get fired." Isla laughed softly. "I don't think anyone here is going to fire you tonight. Graham looked toward the manager as well. I'll make sure of that. Jace gave a small shrug. That might make things awkward. Isla tilted her head. You've already made tonight awkward. Fair. They stood there for a moment longer, three people connected by a story that had taken 8 years to reach the surface. Finally, Jace stepped back. Well, he said quietly, I guess this is where I return to being invisible. Isla looked at him like she disagreed. You were never invisible. Jace wasn't sure about that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned toward the service station, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been when the evening began. Behind him, the music carried through the ballroom, and for the first time in a long time, the memory of Elliot felt less like a burden, and more like something finally understood. The tray felt lighter this time. Jace noticed it the moment he picked it up again. Same glasses, same careful balance between his fingers, same quiet route between tables. But something inside him had shifted. The room had returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed. Guests laughed again, though softer now, like people were aware they had witnessed something they didn't fully understand. The quartet played a brighter piece this time. More movement, more life. Jace moved past a group near the bar and set 2 fresh glasses down without interrupting their conversation. No one commented about what had happened on the dance floor. People in rooms like this rarely did. Moments like that became quiet stories they carried home instead. He reached the service station and placed the empty tray down. The catering manager looked at him over the edge of her clipboard. You planning to make a habit of dancing with the host's daughter? Jace gave a small shrug. Did it look that obvious? She studied him for a second longer, then shook her head slowly. Just don't break anything else tonight. That was the closest thing to approval he expected. He nodded once and picked up another tray. Across the ballroom, Isa stood beside her father now, speaking with a small group of guests. Jace noticed something different immediately. People weren't avoiding her anymore. They stood a little closer. They listened when she spoke. The scar was still there, of course, but something about the way she carried herself had changed. Or maybe the room had changed. Hard to tell which. Jace moved through another row of tables, setting glasses down where they were needed. He didn't look toward Isla again for a while, not because he didn't want to, because he understood the kind of moment they had shared. Moments like that didn't belong in constant attention. They worked better when you let them breathe. Near the window tables, he paused briefly. The chair where Isla had been sitting earlier remained empty. The folded program still lay on the table, the water glass half full. It felt strange now, remembering how the night had started there. Just a girl sitting quietly while laughter drifted past her like something she had learned to ignore. Jace picked up the glass and replaced it with a fresh one without thinking. Have it. He turned back toward the center of the room. Someone raised a hand for another drink. Another table asked for sparkling water. Work continued. Simple tasks, small motions, the kind that grounded a person after heavier things. Across the ballroom, Graham Armitage spoke with a tall man in a gray suit, while holding the handkerchief Jace had given him earlier. Not tucked away, just folded carefully in his palm. Jace noticed the way Graham glanced down at it occasionally, like he was confirming it was still there, that the story attached to it had finally reached him. A few minutes passed. Then someone approached Jace from behind. Excuse me. He turned. Isla stood there. The change in her posture was even clearer up close. Not dramatic, just steadier. You're supposed to be serving drinks, she said. I am. She glanced at the tray. You missed our table. Jace looked at it. Your table already has a full glass. That's not the point. He smiled slightly. You're getting good at this. At what? Pretending you need something so you can talk. She gave him a look that suggested he wasn't wrong. Well, she said, it worked. Jace adjusted the tray against his palm. What's up? Isla glanced briefly across the room toward her father. He's been talking about you. That's dangerous. Not in a bad way. She hesitated, then added quietly, he hasn't smiled like that in a long time. Jace wasn't sure what to do with that information, so he nodded once. I'm glad. Isla studied him again. You're very calm about everything. Should I be panicking? Most people would be. Jace considered that. Most people didn't come here expecting to tell a war story in the middle of a dance floor. She laughed softly. Fair. The music shifted again. Couples moved slowly between the tables. The city lights outside the windows reflected in the polished floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isla said something quieter. You know something strange. What? I don't feel like hiding tonight. Jace looked at her. Good. She touched the edge of the scar on her cheek lightly. I spent a long time thinking this was the first thing people saw. And now? She glanced around the room. Now I think maybe it's just the easiest thing for them to notice. He understood what she meant. Scars told simple stories. People preferred simple stories. But tonight had reminded the room that real ones were more complicated. Isla stepped back slightly. I should go rescue my father, she said. He's about to start telling everyone about the time he and Elliot tried to fix a boat engine and nearly sank the thing. Jace chuckled quietly. That sounds like a story worth hearing. Maybe later. She paused before turning away. Are you working tomorrow? Probably. Same place? Jace shrugged. Depends on who needs extra hands. She nodded slowly, like she was storing that information somewhere. Well, she said, Chicago's not that big. Jace raised an eyebrow. It's pretty big. She smiled. Still. Then she stepped away. Jace watched her cross the ballroom, not hiding near the windows this time. Walking straight into the center of the room, people greeted her differently now. Not with cautious distance, with interest. Across the floor, Graham Armitage placed the handkerchief carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, not hiding it, keeping it close. Jace lifted the tray again and continued through the tables. The night still had an hour left before the staff would begin clearing dishes and stacking chairs. But something about the evening already felt finished. Not the event, the weight he had been carrying. And as he moved quietly between guests, Jace realized something that surprised him. For the first time in 8 years, Elliot's memory no longer felt like something he had to hold alone. By the time the evening began to wind down, the ballroom had softened. The loudest conversations were gone. Guests leaned closer to one another now. Voices quieter, the energy of the night settling into something more reflective than celebratory. Jace carried his last tray of empty glasses toward the service station. The work had slowed enough that the other staff were already beginning the small routines that came before cleanup, stacking unused plates, collecting napkins, straightening chairs. No one would sit in again. His arms felt tired, not from the trays, from the length of the night. He set the glasses down carefully. The catering manager glanced up again. You survived, she said. Barely. She smirked faintly and returned to her clipboard. Jace stepped away from the station and rolled his shoulders once, letting the tension ease out. Across the room, a few guests were saying their goodbyes to Graham Armitage near the entrance. The host stood tall and patient, shaking hands, nodding politely, offering the same calm expression people expected from someone used to rooms like this. But every so often, Graham's hand moved to the inside pocket of his jacket, just briefly, confirming something was still there. The handkerchief. Jace noticed. Then he looked away. That story belonged somewhere else now. Near the windows, the city lights stretched across the lake like thin silver threads. The glass reflected the ballroom behind him, tables, half empty, chairs slightly out of place, the faint glow of chandeliers that would soon dim. He walked toward the window slowly, no tray in his hands now. Just a moment to breathe. The place where Isla had sat earlier felt different when it was quiet again. The small round table remained there, though someone had cleared the glass. Only the folded event program remained. Jace picked it up without thinking. A list of speeches, names of donors, carefully printed words that had filled the evening before anything unexpected had happened. He placed it back down. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't need to turn. You always look at the lake like that? Isla asked. Like what? Like it's telling you something. Jace glanced over his shoulder. She had taken off the formal heels she'd been wearing earlier and carried them in one hand now. The change made her seem less like someone attending a gala and more like someone walking home after a long night. I think it's just quiet, he said. She joined him by the window. The skyline reflected faintly across the glass between them. My father's still talking to people, she said. Hosts never get to leave early. She nodded. But he looks lighter. Jace believed that. Some things stayed with people until someone else brought back the missing piece. They stood there for a moment, watching the dark water beyond the city lights. Isla broke the silence. I've been thinking about something. That's usually dangerous. She smiled faintly. You almost didn't ask me to dance. Jace nodded, very close to not doing it. What changed your mind? He thought about that again. Not the quick answer he gave earlier. The real one. I remembered something Elliot once told me, he said. She turned slightly toward him. What? That small decisions are usually the ones that matter. She considered that. Did he actually say that? No. Jace gave a small shrug. But he lived like it. Isla looked back toward the ballroom. The guests had thinned to only a few scattered groups now. Music no longer played, just the soft sounds of staff clearing dishes and chairs sliding quietly across the floor. My father wants to invite you to dinner, she said suddenly. Jace raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a trap. It's not. You're sure? Mostly. He exhaled softly. I don't know. She studied him. Why not? Jace looked down at his hands. They were rough from years of work that had nothing to do with crystal glasses and polished floors. People like your family live in a different world than I do, he said. Isla didn't answer immediately. Then she said something simple. You lived in my uncle's world. Jace didn't respond, because she wasn't wrong. But that world had been temporary, shared only by a few people in a very specific place. She continued gently. I'm not asking you to become part of our lives. What are you asking? She thought about that for a moment. Just dinner. Jace considered the city lights beyond the glass. Chicago stretched endlessly outward. Millions of small decisions happening at the same time. He could say no, finish the shift, leave the building, return to the quiet routine that had carried him through the last 8 years. Or he could say yes, and allow one unexpected evening to open a door he hadn't planned to walk through. He looked at Isla. She waited without pushing. Finally, he gave a small nod. All right. Her smile came quickly. Not wide, but real. Good. Footsteps approached again. Graham Armitage joined them at the window. The older man looked tired now, the way hosts always did when the final guests were leaving. Am I interrupting? He asked. Only slightly, Isla replied. Graham nodded toward Jace. I was just thanking the staff before they head out. Jace almost laughed. You don't have to do that. I do. Graham's voice stayed calm. Tonight meant something to my family. Jace didn't argue. Some things were easier to accept than deflect. Graham hesitated briefly. Then he said, Isla tells me you agreed to dinner. Jace shot her a quick look. She pretended to examine the lake. Graham smiled faintly. Good. Another quiet pause settled between the three of them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Finally, Jace glanced back toward the ballroom where the last of the tables were being cleared. I should get changed before someone hands me another tray. Graham nodded. Fair. Jace turned to go. Then Isla's voice stopped him. Jace. He looked back. Yeah? She hesitated just long enough for the moment to feel honest. Tonight, you gave my uncle back to us in a way we never had before. Jace didn't know how to answer that, so he simply nodded once. Then he walked toward the service hallway. The staff area smelled like dish soap and coffee. Someone laughed in the distance as trays were stacked and uniforms were folded. Ordinary sounds. Jace hung his jacket on the rack and reached into the pocket where the handkerchief had lived for 8 years. The pocket was empty now. For a second, that felt strange. Then it didn't. Because some things weren't meant to stay with the person who carried them through the hardest part. Some things were meant to find their way home, and as Jace stepped out of the building later that night, the cold Chicago air felt sharper against his face. The lake stretched dark and endless beyond the skyline. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, listening to the quiet hum of the city. 8 years earlier, he had walked away from a battlefield with a weight he didn't understand how to put down. Tonight, in a ballroom he hadn't expected to matter, he had finally set it somewhere it belonged. Not gone, just shared. And sometimes that was enough.